Good morning, and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. Has anyone ever told a lie about you? Said something about you that was not true? How did that make you feel? What if somebody said, I know that you stole that $20, and then you got in trouble for it? They believed that person. You got punished for it. That wouldn't be fair, would it? I mean, we want everyone to know what the truth is. We'd be angry and upset about it. You know, in today's story, which is called the Betrayal and Arrest of Jesus, we are going to see that the people that wanted Jesus killed, they told lies about him. But Jesus didn't defend himself, and he didn't get upset and angry. Now, in the Passion Week, it's Thursday, but you know, it's Thursday night. And everything that happens in our story today happened during the night and right into Friday morning. Now, Jesus had gone up to the Mount of Olives to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he had brought his disciples with him. And he had asked them to stay awake and to watch and to pray with him, but they just couldn't stay awake. They fell asleep. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the 3rd time, Jesus woke them up and said, Rise. Get up, it's time to go. And as he was speaking, there was a crowd of men coming against him. They had torches and they had clubs and swords. They were coming to arrest Jesus. Now Judas was with them. Judas was the disciple who was betraying Jesus. He had agreed to hand Jesus over to them for 30 pieces of silver. They agreed. And Judas said to them, You'll know the one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. And he came right up to Jesus in the garden and he said, Greetings, Rabbi. And Jesus said, Friend, go ahead and do what you have come to do. You know, isn't it amazing that Jesus called him friend when he knew that Judas was about to betray him? Well, Judas kissed him on the cheek and they arrested him immediately. Now Peter was standing right beside Jesus, and he pulled out his dagger, and he struck the slave of the high priest, and he slashed off his ear. Jesus turned to Peter and he said, Put away your sword. He said, Don't you realize if I needed defending, I could simply call on my Father in heaven, and he would send 12,000 angels to rescue me. And then he healed the servant's ear. And then he turned to the crowd and he said, Why have you come to capture me like a robber with clubs and with swords? He said, I was teaching in the temple every day. You could have come and seized me at any time. But he said, the reason that it's happening this way is because it's exactly what the prophets said in the Bible. It's exactly happening the way that they said it would. Well, the disciples were full of fear at what was happening. They just ran off. They just deserted Jesus, just like Jesus had said that they would. Now, the first place that they took Jesus was to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. But you know, Peter was following from a distance. And when they got to the place of Caiaphas, Peter went into the courtyard and he sat with the guards because he wanted to see how everything was going to end up. Well, normally a trial like this is held in the temple in the daytime and everything is done properly and in order. But you know, they had arranged to meet secretly at Caiaphas' house because they were determined that Jesus should be found guilty. And they had arranged for several people to be there to tell lies about Jesus. And they did. But they couldn't prove them. In fact, there was quite a bit of arguing going on. And finally, Caiaphas stepped up to Jesus and he said, Don't you have anything to say about all these things that are being said about you? But you know, Jesus didn't say anything. Well, Caiaphas was desperate. He was determined that Jesus should be guilty of something to die for. And so Caiaphas said, Tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Jesus said, You've said it. I am the Son of God. Now, if you claim to be the Son of God and you weren't, that was called blasphemy. And that was worthy of death. And Caiaphas did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and so he shouted, "Blasphemy! You are going to die for claiming to be the Son of God." And immediately all the religious leaders, they stepped forward and they began to spit on Jesus, and they began to hit him with their fists, and they began to say, "Oh, tell us who hit you. You're the Son of God. Tell us." Well, meanwhile, back in the courtyard, it was a cold night. Peter was warming himself by the fire, and a servant girl saw Peter, and she went up to him and she said, "Oh, you are one of the ones that was with Jesus." Peter said in front of everybody, "I don't know what you're talking about." And a little later, Peter was over by the gate in the courtyard, and another servant girl came up and said, "Oh, you were with Jesus, Jesus from Galilee." And Peter said, "I don't know the man." He said that in front of everybody. "I don't know who he is." And a little later, some bystanders went by and they said, "Oh, you're one of Jesus' disciples. We can tell by the accent that you're from Galilee." And this time Peter swore. He said, "I am not lying. I do not know who that man is." And just then a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said. Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows on Friday morning, you'll pretend that you don't know me 3 times. Peter went out of the courtyard and he wept bitterly. He was so ashamed of himself. Now, these religious leaders, they did have authority over the Jews. They were allowed a certain amount of ruling, but they didn't have the authority to sentence somebody to death. Only the Roman government could do that. And so what they did was they bound Jesus and they took him to Pilate, who was the Roman governor at that time, because they were sure that they would be able to convince Pilate that Jesus should be crucified. Now, meanwhile, Judas, when he realized that Jesus was being condemned to death, he was sorry about what he had done. And so he ran to the temple where there were some other leading priests. It was morning now. And he ran into the temple and he tried to give back those 30 pieces of silver. He said, I've sinned. He said, I've betrayed an innocent man. He is not guilty. He has not done anything wrong. But the priest said, "What do we care about that? That's your problem." Well, Judas flung down those 30 pieces of silver on the temple floor and he ran out. He was overwhelmed with what he had done. Well, it's Friday morning, and they have brought Jesus before Pilate. So Pilate turned to Jesus and he said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You said it. Yes, I am." And immediately all the religious leaders came forward with all their accusations. And finally, Pilate turned to Jesus and he said, "Well, don't you have anything to say about all these charges that they're bringing against you?" But Jesus wouldn't say anything. Pilate was so surprised. Now, it was a custom of the Roman government that once a year at Passover, they would release a prisoner to the people. That would be like saying, even though you're guilty, you can go free. It's like being forgiven. And Pilate knew that those religious leaders had just arrested Jesus because they were jealous of him. And so he said to the crowd that was in front of him, he said, "Who should I release to you this year? Should I release Barabbas?" Barabbas was a murderer, and he was a well-known criminal. "Should I release Barabbas, or should I release Jesus to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Well, then, Pilate said, "Well, then what should I do with Jesus?" They said, "Crucify him." And Pilate said, "Well, what has he done wrong?" But they just kept saying, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." Well, Pilate could tell the crowd was ready to riot. And so he released Barabbas and he had Jesus flogged. Now, the Romans had something called a flagrum. You can see how the ends, they have metal on them. And that's what he had Jesus flogged with, a flagrum. It was a terrible flogging. And then he handed Jesus over to his soldiers to be crucified. And you know, the soldiers took off Jesus' garment and they put on him a purple robe. Purple like the kings wear, because Jesus had said he was king of the Jews. So they put that purple robe on him, and then they made a crown, but it was out of thorns. They put it on his head. Then they spit in his face. They hit him with their fists. They put a staff in his hand, and then they bowed down and said, "Oh, hail, King of the Jews! Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they took the staff out of his hand and they beat him with it over and over and over again. And finally they stopped. They took off the robe and they put back on Jesus' own garment. And then they led him away to be crucified. You know, in today's story, we have seen Judas betray Jesus. The disciples ran away. Peter pretended not to know Jesus 3 times. The soldiers mocked him. They beat him. It was a dark night of suffering for Jesus. But you know, Jesus did not resist. He was faithful to go along that pathway of suffering to the cross because he was devoted to his Father. And it was the Father's plan that he should go to the cross and die and pay for your sin and for mine. Jesus is a wonderful Savior. All right, see you next time.